to the New America Foundation. My name is Patrick Doherty. I am the Deputy Director of the American Strategy Program here at New America. What I want to do is frame today's event in light of some important news made by CIA Director Michael Hayden yesterday and recorded by Walter Pincus, who should be coming today. For those of you who missed it, the CIA can now confirm that Iraq is no longer the central front on the war on terror. It's good news to know. Whether this is, as General Hayden noted, because al-Qaeda doesn't think Iraq is the central front on the war on terror, or somehow tied to the election of an American president whose middle name is Hussein, I will leave to you to determine. But what it certainly means is that the new president will inherit a national security landscape that is nothing if not shifting. Before Iraq was the central front in the war on terror, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld said, "You don't get to go to war with the army you want, but the army you have." Rumsfeld, as we know, wanted to topple Saddam Hussein's regime with as few U.S. forces as possible and leave as quickly as possible. He did not want an occupation, did not have the forces for an occupation, and did not plan for an occupation. And it was from this second great miscalculation regarding Iraq, the inadequate U.S. order of battle, where we see the fertile ground for contractors to fill the gaps, securing the rear areas of the American presence, and sometimes famously getting caught on the front lines and derailing the delicate politics of counterinsurgency. Under the Obama administration, we can anticipate that our military missions will be shifting in both objective and theater. But as our nation's policymakers, new and returning, begin to think about how best can America satisfy the incredible manpower commitments of these missions, contractors, we know, will be part of the mix. What have we learned in the last 8 years? What should the new administration and the 111th Congress do to manage the role and repercussions of civilians in the battlefield? These are questions that have been explored at length in what I think is an essential new report right here by New America's Privatization and Foreign Policy Initiative, led by Michael Cohen, but co-authored by Roger Karstens and Michael's co-director of the initiative, Maria Figueroa-Cupchu. If you haven't picked up a copy, please do so. It's in the back. You'll want to have it. Today, we're going to discuss this topic at length. I don't want to take any more of your time. What I want to do, though, is introduce our panel. Michael Cohen, a good friend of mine here at New America Foundation, is the director of the Privatization of Foreign Policy Initiative. He's got a new book out, which is great, Live from the Campaign Trail. It has nothing to do with contracting. Live from the Campaign Trail, the greatest presidential campaign speeches of the 20th century and how they shaped modern America. So if you want to engage in questions about Obama's rhetorical style, he's the man to do it. But today is really going to be more about contracting. He also has during the campaign, had a great blog column at the New York Times online section. Tara Lee is a partner at DLA Piper's litigation practice based in Northern Virginia. She primarily focuses her practice on national security and battlefield incident litigation on behalf of defense contractors and is bringing a real wealth of experience on the contracting issue from that side of the story. Kevin Lanigan is the director of the Law and Security Program at Human Rights First. He leads Human Rights First's efforts to ensure greater understanding of and respect for human rights in the U.S. national security policy through a combination of policy-relevant research, analysis, and advocacy. And both Tara and Kevin have been great collaborators with Michael on this project. And then David Eisenberg is going to wrap up and take a look at this question of contracting in the context of the Obama administration, I believe. He's an independent Washington, D.C. based analyst and writer on military, foreign policy, national and international security issue, and his column Dogs of War focuses on contemporary military affairs. What we hope to do today is just have Michael give us the summary of the report, again, changing the culture of Pentagon contracting, and then we'll go to, I think it's Tara and then Kevin is the is the batting order, and then David will wrap it up, and then we'll go to Q&A. And because we're live webcasting this morning, I'm going to just repeat your question as you ask it, so just be prepared for that. And with that, Michael Cohen.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate that introduction. I want to thank Tara, David, and Kevin for coming today, and for all of you for braving the rain this morning to come out to hear us. The theme of today's event is how's the privatization of national security gone too far? And the best way to answer, that question, I think, is both yes and no. And allow me to explain why that's not actually a cop-out answer. Over the past 5.5 years, as we know, America's dependence on contractors has exploded. From intelligence gathering, logistical support, personal security, training, operational support tasks, the efforts of contractors are now integral to Americans' security and stabilization missions around the world. And today we have about 230,000 contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is, of course, more than the number of troops we have in both theaters. And since 2003, 1 out of every $5 spent in fighting these wars has been spent on contractors. And for the most part, it's fair to say the American people have actually gotten their money's worth. The U.S. operation in Iraq is, and Doug Brooks can stop me if I get this wrong, is the best supplied, best supported U.S. military operation in American history. Is that right, Doug? Yes. I appreciate that. Even General David Petraeus has said that he cannot complete his mission in Iraq without the use of contractors. And for all the terrible stories we've heard over the past couple of years, whether it's the tragic incident in East Square Square last September, whether these stories of corruption and mismanagement of funds that Special Inspector General for Iraqi reconstruction have exposed, for the most part, the work there contractors have been positive and has been defined by, let's say, professionalism. And I think what it suggests is that contractors, the outsourcing of military functions, can obviously have a positive impact on America's national security operations. But of course, there's another side to the issue, which is why we wrote this report. Because while the U.S. reliance on contractors obviously has increased, there's not been a commensurate increase in oversight and management of this virtual army. What has gone too far, I would argue, is not necessarily the privatization of national security, but the means by which America is increasing its reliance and the lack of forethought for how contractors and various non-state actors fit into the larger scheme of U.S. national security operations. The Pentagon and the military today is now completely reliant on contractors to complete its key missions. And but again, over the past 5.5 years, no one has really asked the serious questions about what this increased dependence means, how it should be dealt with, and how the military should adapt itself to this new reality. Among the issues that are not addressed, I mean, the first and most obvious one is the lack of proper oversight and management of the contractor force. A determination of which functions should be contracted out, which should remain in-house. This has been done generally on an ad hoc basis. Restructuring the total force to reflect the growing role and responsibility of contractors, a conversation that, again, has not really occurred. And then folding contracting into military requirements, military planning, and the achievement of missions. As somebody said to us at a conference we held a few months ago, that no one at the Pentagon decided to send 200,000 contractors to Iraq. This has been a decision that has developed without any sort of real sense of long-term planning and thinking. And as one other person said to us, instead of answering the questions that I've raised here, the military's attitude has been sort of fire and forget. Now, I should say, of course, that in the past 2 years since Secretary Gates took over the Pentagon, there have been significant improvements in accountability and oversight of contractors, and ones that I hope the new administration will build on. But what, in my view, is needed is a larger, deeper shift in the Pentagon, a cultural shift, whereby civilian and military leaders taking steps to fully integrate private contractors, not only into the force structure and planning, but also into achievement of its mission requirements. So with that in mind, I'm going to just lay out a couple of recommendations that we've made in the report that I think both Congress and the military leadership, as well as the new administration, I think should consider. And the first one is sort of somewhat controversial. We argue that the U.S. should begin the process of transitioning away from the use of private security contractors in the battle space and build up the capabilities of State Department's Bureau of Diplomatic Security and the military police to take on security functions. Now, I should say that there's a lot of caveats to that particular call because it's not so simple just to say to get rid of them. For example, I would not in any way associate myself with the calls in some on Capitol Hill to get rid of all contractors completely. That's not feasible, at least in the short term, and I don't think it's even a smart idea to do. There's certainly stabilization missions, static defense requirements that contractors can play an important role in. Our focus is more on using security contractors in active battle space for mainly private security details and personal security details, and convoy protection. And more, our view of why this should happen is the difficulty in ensuring control of these actors and proper accountability of them, proper oversight as well. However, as this transition takes place, and it's a long-term transition, it would take a number of years to do, a couple of things I think should happen. First of all, the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, MIJA as is known, should be expanded to govern the actions of private security contractors. There is a bill in Congress now pending on this issue that's been held up by the Bush administration, and I think this will be an important piece of business for the new Congress to act on. In addition, we need really need improved training of contractors, better vetting of third country nationals, which make up a huge part of the contractor force, and third-party accreditation of contractors. And finally, we need to create and sustain an enforcement arm of the FBI to conduct overseas investigations of private contractors, as well as an extraterritorial U.S. attorney to prosecute criminal behavior. One of the stories, I think, of contracting over the past 5.5 years is real abdication of responsibility by the Department of Justice in investigating contractor abuses and contractor crimes, and we really do need an extraterritorial U.S. attorney to focus on these and an investigative arm that will gather evidence. Second, the term of art that's used often to describe how contractors are used is inherently governmental. It is this very opaque bureaucratic term that no one seems to really understand. There are multiple dozens and dozens of definitions in the U.S. Code, and but our view is that it's a very flawed and widely misunderstood term and only engenders confusion. How and when to use private contractors, and we think it should be transitioned away from. And instead, the question should really be a focus by not just the military, but all government agencies on achievement of mission success and what are core competencies of contractors and government employees, and how do you find the right mix between those two. And we advocate that Congress should permit agencies broader discretion in determining where and how contractors should be used, with, of course, certain red lines that Congress would draw, and, of course, the proper accountability mechanism, oversight mechanisms, in place. Next, we think that each branch of the military should designate a high-ranking official to conduct a top-to-bottom review of how that branch interacts with contractors and where there are areas for lesser or greater reliance. The Army has already done this. The Gensler report, which is the best report, I think, written on contracting, well, aside from the one that we did, obviously. But it's a great report, and I think it's a good model for what other branches should do. Of course, the key is to actually implement the recommendations in those reports, but it's a good model for, I think, for the other branches of the military. The next thing is the strengthening the contractor and acquisition workforce. This workforce has been cratered, frankly, in the past 5.5 years. It's been cut at the same time that its responsibilities have increased exponentially, which doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's frankly a lot of the problem we've had with oversight of contractors in Iraq is the weakening of the workforce, and also it needs to be made more attractive career stream for those in the military. This is, I think, an enormously important recommendation, and one that there's been a lot of work on this in Congress, but it's something that has to happen. And I think already the Pentagon is beginning to move on this, but it really has to happen because, as we've seen, we are relying more on contractors. We don't have the people in place to manage them. Next, there needs to be a better responsibility in the military for contracting, which means creating a clear chain of command from Secretary of Defense to the Joint Chiefs of Staff down to the Service Department that lays out the responsibilities for contracting and holds commanders accountable for the integration or lack thereof of contractors in the total force, and holds them accountable for how they utilize contractors and how they think about planning for missions and the use of contractors in those missions. Next, one thing that someone said to us at our conference was that contractor management is as important a skill for officers as warfighting. Now, there are those in the military, of course, who would not agree with that. But the point I think that this argument makes is that this is an incredibly important skill that's not being taught to basically officers. And so contractor management oversight needs to be a part of officer training, needs to be a part of military education. As of now, it's an elective at a lot of the service academies, and it has to change. It has to be a fundamental part of how officers are trained, because if you're, more often than not, officers are dealing with contractors on a regular basis. And you have right now more contractors than troops. You can see what how the challenge lies. Finally, contracting should be an area of emphasis, I believe, in the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review. It needs to be, again, a key part of military planning going forward. In the end, contracting is not going away anytime soon. If anything, it's probably going to increase, and not just contracting, but reliance on non-state actors, whether it's NGOs or other private actors, even for-profit companies. And the solution is not to get rid of these actors, but is to figure out how government can utilize them more effectively by putting proper oversight and accountability mechanisms in place, and by integrating them, and this is very important, integrating them into planning, training, and force structure discussions. Without the sort of, I think, institutional changes we're suggesting, the problems the United States has experienced in connection with the use of contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan will continue, and I think will significantly harm the military's ability to adjust to the evolving security challenges of the 21st century. And I think with these changes in place, I think contractors can continue to play an important and active role in meeting America's national interests in the years to come. So with that, I will turn it over to Tara to tell me all the reasons why I'm wrong.
Oh, that's so not what I'm going to do. Thank you very much, Michael. I want to tell everybody in the room how honored and sort of humbled I am to get to sit up here, because these are the three guys whose writing I most often turn to so that I don't say things that are dumb. Because they're sitting up here today, I'm at a distinct disadvantage, because normally I'd be going to read what the three of them had written about it before I said anything. So I'm honored to be included. I also want to really commend the report. I think they did a number of things very, very well, and they undertook a task that is monumentally more difficult than this one, right? Reading the report and identifying for you the things that I would have done differently or that I'm not happy with is significantly easier than undertaking the entire task and pulling it all together, and they really did really a fantastic job at a really difficult issue that lots of people have been trying to look at, and very few agencies or individuals have been able to come up with the type of recommendations that could actually be implemented, and I think they did a really good job there. In particular, if you've read the report, you see where they identify cultural problems and bureaucratic obstacles. Those are the sort of critical underpinnings to in need of correction before you get anywhere near implementing the specific fixes. And so I really commend them for their focus on those issues. Having said that, there are a couple just teensy-weensy little things that I might have concluded differently.
So it begins.
Yeah. There's, in the area of flawed premises and unsound conclusions. There are two flawed premises, I think. Yeah. In terms of premises, just a couple things I want us to all stay mindful of where we go into our debate about these issues. One is the numbers themselves. We hear over and over again about how many more contractors we have now than we've ever had before. But take that in some historical context and recognize that, say we're comparing to World War II. World War II, you had an end of war and then a reconstruction period, right? And the reconstruction was all done by contractors, and we don't count them in the comparison numbers, because now in Iraq, we're reconstructing and war fighting all at the same time. So if you look at the 200,000 contractors numbers, and if you look at the $1 in $5 spent, if somebody would go in and extract from that number anybody who's just building hospitals and fixing streets and doing reconstruction tasks, I'm not sure we have the perceived crisis of an increase in numbers that we're constantly clamoring about. And secondly, to the extent that there is an increase in numbers, there are historical fluctuations in our choice about how we structure our force. And we may just very well be at a time in our country's history when we want a more balanced force, when there are a limited number of things that we want to have to do with our standing army. So in terms of the identification of the perceived crisis, I wanted to bring that little bit of perspective to it. Secondly, I want to pose the question of how concerned we'd be and how much talking about this we'd be doing if there hadn't been Nice or Square in September. We're talking about an individual incident that has not been fully brought to bear. I don't think anybody in the room has read the FBI's report. I don't think any of us actually know what happened in Nisour Square, and we're in sort of a CNN age of reporting of these kinds of things, where a single incident can get so much attention and can bring so much overcorrection without us ever getting to the actual facts of what happened. I haven't seen any empirical data that suggests to me that contractors use indiscriminate force in any greater percentage occurrence than the active duty military does. So those two things, I think, are conflating the debate, and I wanted to address them in terms of the potential that we're working from some, not maybe flawed premises, but not fully explored premises. The second of those premises is the way that the task is phrased. The challenge that the report issues is that we need to fundamentally rethink the way the United States uses non-state actors. I would suggest that the better debate would be to fundamentally rethink and to make a more pragmatic and accurate assessment of who is a state actor. The fundamental question about who is a state actor is kind of the overarching, big, important, everybody back up and decide that first issue. Because states have obligations. They have obligations to their citizens. They have obligations to the international community, to other states, to the rule of law. And the premise that I think we all agree on is that states can't circumvent those obligations by contracting them out. I mean, that's what we're afraid of when we want to rear back from contractors. So the question we ought to be asking is who is acting as the state? And the way we're trying to figure that out now has to do with looking at the inherently governmental function test, which we all agree is pretty fundamentally flawed and not all that helpful. I would pose a better question. I think that what we ought to be asking when we're assessing who's acting for the state and how we feel about it is whether or not the private company is going to be empowered by the law of the state to exercise functions of a public character, functions that are normally exercised by state organs. Because a state doesn't act as a state. A state acts through its organs and instrumentalities. Somebody has to be out there doing something. So it's either an organization, a business unit, a division of the government. Sometimes a bank can act as a state. Many times an individual can act as a state. And the problem that we've gotten into is that nobody passed a law. There was no act of law that determined what private companies would be empowered to act as a state. It was all done through contract, which means every contract can be different, and it's about as good as the contracting officer who wrote it. So we should back up, I think, and I do agree to some extent with the report's recommendations that there's been a real abdication of responsibility on the part of the executive and legislative branches. They should have said something. They should have given some direction. It was up to them to do it. But that brings me to the first of the conclusions that I think are slightly unsound. Because the recommendation in the report is that the way to correct that now is to have, I think it says, give broad discretion to government agencies to make decisions on force structure. I want to urge everyone to decide for themselves and to consider, and those of you who do this for a living, to put some research and writing into the notion of what agency and what branch of government ought to be making that decision. Is it constitutional for that decision to be made by the Congress? Are the government agencies the best ones to make that decision? I don't want to be all John you on everybody, but there's at least an argument to say that perhaps the executive is in the best position to determine the delegation of the sovereign's authorities. Because that's really what you're doing. You're allowing the sovereign to delegate certain powers. And we recognize that that's what the sovereign does because it acts through organs and instrumentalities. In some cases, that's going to be the military. In some cases, that'll be civilians. Who do we want to make that decision? Who should we turn to and demand that they make that decision? Because right now it's happening contract by contract and it's being controlled by the market. The other reason that you have to have an allocation of responsibility, if not in the legislative or executive, because in the absence of one of those two branches weighing in, the judiciary is going to do it. And that's what we've started to see happen. That's what I do all day. Where the other two branches have failed, the judiciary will step in. And the rules that you get as a result of that, by having fact-based determinations in individual cases with litigation attorneys on either side urging judges to advocate a certain remedy, they're going to be a little convoluted. And the best example I can give you of that is the Saleh case. Everybody's familiar with Abu Ghraib. I would not dream of trying to make the argument that the interrogation of prisoners on a battlefield is a non-governmental function, right? If a sovereign acts at all, It acts to project force abroad, to detain, to punish, to interrogate. And through machinations that we can, go on and on about for a long time, those functions were being accomplished in part by contractors. And in the absence of a rule of law or some clear message or direction given by either of the legislative or executive branches of the government, we have two contractors, one charged with the responsibility for conducting interrogations, and another contractor charged with responsibility for translation. And now the question comes to the courts. Were they acting as the state? Because the flip side of the obligations of a state are the immunities of a state. And if you act as a state, you have the obligations of the state, you also carry the immunities of the state. So that what we have now is a rule of law that says a foreign government or a former government official from, for example, Somalia, I use that example because that happens to be my case, and though I get introduced all the time as defense lawyer for industry, I also have a lot of cases on the flip side of that for human rights victims in other countries who have been victimized by genuine war crimes, human rights abuses on a scale that dwarfs anything we argue about at Abu Ghraib or in Iraq. And the leaders of those regimes, the most despotic and tyrannical regimes history has seen, are immune from civil suit in the United States because they're sovereigns, because they act as sovereigns. It's foreign sovereign immunity. But here in the United States now, we've got contractors performing those functions, and they don't get the immunities that go with them. And arguably, it has not been explained to them or directed to them in any sort of rule of law way. It's entirely possible to make the argument they don't carry the obligations of statehood. So on both sides of it, it's problematic. It does keep me really busy, but you can at least make the argument that when contractors are out there performing functions that are essentially making them organs of the state, recognizing that that might just be a choice we make, and I'll get to in a minute why that might not be a bad choice to make. If we're going to do that, they should also carry the immunities that the state would have if it acted on its own. That brings me to my last of the unsound conclusions, which is the fundamental conclusion that we should transition away from the use of private security contractors. I think it's going to be a really popular conclusion. I think there's going to be a drumbeat, and there will be no shortage of people saying what a fantastic recommendation that is. It's already starting. I'm a little worried that it's just going to snowball, and we're going to start leaping into the identification of functions we don't want contractors to do. What I would urge is that when we identify a problem, we come up with a solution that symmetrically matches the problem. And in this case, the identified problem is that there's been an increased involvement by non-state actors that's not being matched by a commensurate effort to manage and oversee that process. So to me, the resultant solution should be management and oversight of the process. And everybody agrees we're moving in that direction, we're plugging the holes that we should. That's enough of a solution. The additional recommendation to transition away is not, to me, logically connected. And I think it's an overcorrection. And there are a number of reasons why I think overcorrection is a bad idea. One of them is sort of pragmatic. And please, let's all go beyond the pragmatic in these questions. Let's never say it just isn't feasible. For heaven's sakes, we're the United States of America. It can be feasible. We have done all kinds of fantastic things in this country. We can figure out how to do without contractors. Feasibility is never a legitimate response. But here are a couple others. The military, like any organization, has a limited number of core competencies and only one primary mission. The primary mission of our armed forces should be to kill the enemy. We may not be happy that that's the mission of our armed forces. Some of us may not like to see them out there effectively accomplishing that mission, but let's not get confused about what their primary mission should be. And the more functions that you redline and you eliminate from the pool that you can apply contractors to, and the more you load into the military, the farther away they get from their primary mission. There's a couple great recently retired Army guys who are out there writing about this exact problem, and I'd be happy to direct you guys to their writing, but I think it's something that we're not focusing on enough. I think there's going to be a clamoring in Congress soon for functions that we're redlining away from contractors without stopping to say, why are we doing that, and is now the right time? I would suggest now's probably not the right time. We face a threat of a magnitude that we've never seen in history. There are very well-equipped non-state actors with the declared intent and obvious capacity to do grave harm to massive amounts of civilians. This is a time when we need the best resources that the United States has to offer, the best resources that the whole world has to offer. And to eliminate from that pool of resources a whole category of potential contributors is, I think, unwise. So if there's a really good reason and a symmetrical match to the identified problem, let's do it. But if there isn't, let's make sure we back up. Kevin is next. And if there is anybody that I would recommend to you who might be able to tell you what the very good reasons are, it's Mr. Lanigan.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much. I'm Kevin Lanigan with Human Rights First. We have been focused on the issue of contractors for several years, really since Abu Ghraib and the Titan and khaki contractors that Tara mentioned involved in detainee abuse there. Our interest and activity in this field became much greater about a year ago when we began a very in-depth look at the issue of security contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while I joined Tara in complimenting the New America Foundation for what truly is an important and essential new report, I would point out it's only the third best report on this subject, and you'll see out at the table a couple that Human Rights First has done, including with this report, a blueprint that we've prepared for the new administration and the new Congress on addressing accountability for private contractors abroad, which we actually haven't released yet. We plan right now to release it on Monday, but given the opportunity here, I thought I would shill for it to an extent. But I do want to talk mostly about the New America Foundation's new report, which really is an important addition to the debate and discussion on contracting. And as Tara mentioned, in many ways, what they've done here is to tackle the much harder and more complex and more subtle aspects of the contracting issue. It is conceptually much easier to discuss and debate and to prescribe how to solve and to actually solve the issue of criminal accountability, for example, for Nisour Square. I wouldn't, we absolutely think that it is essential that that be done, and that's a terribly important obligation on this country to get our legal act together and our resource commitments together to make sure that contractors the United States government fields abroad as part of a warfighting mission or otherwise can be held accountable for serious crimes that they commit. And that is an absolutely critical obligation. But the issue of accountability for contractors is a lot more than criminal accountability and then from doing some prosecutions. In the New America Foundation report, at one point it's presented in the introduction as addressing a distinct set of issues from accountability, noting that a lot of people have been talking, like Human Rights First, about these accountability issues, and that this new report is addressing a different sphere. From our perspective, this report addresses very critical accountability issues, and much like with military accountability in the justice system, courts martial in the military are only the very top of the accountability pyramid in the military, and that's and that really only comes into play when there's been a failure of discipline and a failure of accountability, and this is the very last check. And criminal prosecutions as well with contractors is exactly the same thing. It is, criminal prosecution, the ability to do that and to do it when it's warranted is a critical problem that we need to solve. But there is a much more complex, much larger portion of the regulatory, the contracting, and the cultural pyramid underneath the issue of criminal prosecutions that needs to be effectively tackled, and the New America Foundation and Michael and his co-authors have made a critical contribution here to helping us learn how to effectively tackle those issues as from our point of view, an essential part of the accountability issue. It's interesting as we look at the recommendations here to address the culture of contracting and the need for the military to more effectively integrate contracting, including through schoolhouse training. What the New America Foundation here is really pushed the ball further down the court. We do have some issues with the report, which I'll also get to in a moment, as well as some issues with Tara. But in really important ways, they've moved the ball farther down the court to enable policymakers and people who are working with policymakers to really sort out some hard and difficult issues here. As having read the report and with just the further illumination of this morning's conversation, I think the New America Foundation is absolutely right that there has to be a clear contracting chain from the National Command Authority, really Secretary of Defense on down. But to an extent, I mean, the more you build up the procurement and contracting and auditing and inspector general functions that need to be built up in order to make sure that we do contracting right. In the military environment, all of that sort of competes with command authority. And it's going to be very difficult to sort out what kind of authority and responsibility military commanders actually have over contractors as opposed to the contracting chain. And those are two distinctly different chains. And as we build up, as we have to, the contracting chain, that will actually compete with a military commander's ability, or at least apparent authority, to directly influence or direct contractors. What I think, as I think about this, and it's really a relatively minor point, but I think important, at the infantry school at Fort Benning, it's probably not contract management that they need to be taught. Infantry officers who are going to be commanders need to be taught from early on about planning, to integrate contracting into their overall operations, and how to interact with the whole management and procurement aspect of the Department of Defense operation. What this leads me to is really what the metaphor for this is that the Department of Defense and military commanders and military education really need to think of contracting as another element of jointness. Through Goldwater Nichols and subsequent legislation and regulation, there has been a real cultural change in the individual services that they have to work together, that their planning has to be inter-service planning, that any serving officer in any of the services who aspires to high command is going to have to serve on joint staffs through the time, through that person's career. And there probably needs to be a similar acceptance. That contracting, it's one thing to say that contracting is part of the total force, but it's another to kind of conceive it as an aspect of jointness. And to do that might move this farther down the road, and I think it's just a different way of articulating the recommendation that Michael and his co-authors here have made in their new report. On some issues that I'm not sure the extent to which we really have disagreement or just take a different perspective or have a different take on some of the important recommendations or assumptions that are in the new report. We've had more of a discussion this morning on inherently governmental than I thought we might, and it is a very flawed concept, and it hasn't apparently been an obstacle to any government agency to do any contracting they want to do. I don't, but I'm not sure that the answer is to abandon that and to come up with some different approach or different definition, and certainly not to give broad discretion to government agencies. Government agencies now have broad discretion. And I think that, Tara said that what we, I think she was skeptical of the notion of identifying functions we don't want contractors to do. And I think that's exactly what we need to do. And I think we could do it under an inherently governmental function analysis if we took a hard and honest look at that, or if a different body, such as perhaps the Commission on Wartime Contracting, took a different look at that, as opposed to an agency look where the agency is self-interest to come out with an answer that's going to allow them to contract the services they want to contract. Or it could be under a different framework. But the notion that there is some magical different framework that if we simply adopt it, it will give us the answers, I think is unrealistic. And ultimately, I think we do need to identify the functions we don't want contractors to do, obviously, identify criteria for determining that. We certainly think that an obvious candidate for functions we're very skeptical that contractors should be doing are interrogations of detainees on the battlefield. We think there are aspects of operations that security contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan have been doing that they probably shouldn't be doing. But ultimately, I think it is going to take a new look at this. I don't think it necessarily has to abandon inherently governmental. But ultimately, we do have to decide that we're going to identify functions that contractors shouldn't do. There is, as a part of the New America Foundation's analysis, there is a discussion, a brief discussion of the issue of mercenaries. Human Rights First has never branded or attacked private security contractors in Iraq or elsewhere as mercenaries, and we're not going to begin doing that today. But there is an important assumption that's embedded in the New America Foundation's analysis of this issue that we do think it's important to bring out into the open today, because we think it has impeded getting at the right answers in the United States to this issue of what contractors shouldn't be doing. And that is how we define direct participation in hostilities. The United States, unlike most, if not all, other nations and responsible organizations like the International Commission of the Red Cross, defines direct participation in hostilities very narrowly and with an offensive connotation. Basically, launching an attack or participating in offensive operations is how the United States government tends to define direct participation in hostilities. Thus, under that analysis, at Christmas 1944, in the Ardennes offensive, the German attackers were engaged in the direct participation in hostilities, but the 101st Airborne defending Bastogne wasn't. And that, that's a silly definition, and it's a dangerous definition. It has led the United States government and the Department of Defense to be able to rationalize the use of private security contractors in Iraq doing everything that they're doing as not involved in the direct participation in hostilities because they're not involved in offensive military operations. But it's not a sound definition, and it has led to the overuse and over-reliance on private security contractors. Probably surprisingly to Tara, I think we largely join many of her concerns about the breadth of the recommendation of the New America Foundation in terms of moving completely away from U.S. government use on private security contractors, including even in a battle space, where we see the zone of activity of private security contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan as being really problematic is when they're protecting military targets In Iraq and Afghanistan, we are at war. It's not a declared war, but this country hasn't been in a declared war since the Second World War, and there are ebbs and flows in that war, and and to an extent, at least at times, as General Krulak once described it, it's a three-block war, where one block there's reconstruction going on, another block stability operations, and another block a very hot war. So it's a very complex environment, but in war, military targets are lawful targets of the enemy. And in an active combat environment like that, private contractors, private security contractors, we believe should not be protecting lawful military targets, and that includes static site security for military forward operating bases. It includes convoy security on military convoys and personal security on military personnel. That still would leave a wide range of activity for private security contractors, including in Iraq and Afghanistan, to be, we think, legitimately under international law and human rights law, protecting civilian targets, civilian persons, civilian resources and facilities, but not military facilities. And we also think that if you just look at the scale of challenges that this country is confronting across the world, while our military commitment to Iraq is enormous, this country, as far as the eye can see, is going to continue to be involved without substantial commitment of military resources to the reconstruction and support of governments of countries that are in conflict. And whether it is sending a military or a police training mission, or sending Bearing Point or other contractors to work with a nation's finance ministry, or sending USAID or their implementing partners or grantees on various sorts of development and redevelopment projects. We will be doing a lot of that. We'll be doing it in secure areas. Those people will need security, and we'll have no significant military mission there to do that. And private security contractors I think, clearly must play an indispensable role in doing that. It is, however, essential that we get accountability straight. It's essential from the criminal prosecution point of view, and it's essential, again, returning to the New America Foundation's report, that the much harder and heavier lifting of addressing the cultural issues, not just in the Department of Defense, but other agencies, the Department of State as well, and really resourcing the contract management and support and procurement and audit and inspector general functions to make sure that we can do this right when we do contracting is a tremendous challenge for us all. And the New America Foundation has made a very important contribution here to helping us all and helping the new administration address that challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. David Eisenberg, please.
Hopefully last, but hopefully I'm not the least. One of the problems of being the last speaker, of course, is that usually, as happened here, many of your fellow panelists have already hit on some of your carefully constructed, thought out at great length points. So if I repeat something you've already heard, blame them. First, thanks to, like everybody else, thanks to New America Foundation for having done the whole thing, for having started the process, having the dialogue, getting people together to talk about it, producing the report, and thank you for coming here to favor that debate. Let me just say that having followed this issue of both private military and security contractors for some years now, and I feel really aged by it because I started doing it back in the early mid-90s when there were only 3 firms anybody paid any attention to, and back then it was Executive Outcomes of South Africa, MPRI locally, and DynCorp. And I can recall spending, having an intern spend nearly a month when I was writing a report on it back in the mid-90s, and this was pre-web. She spent a month scouring the internet, and she came up with a total of 60 to 70 references. in the best spirit of the Virginia Slims commercial, we've come a long way, baby. It's clearly not your parents' contractors' industry anymore. I should also say that since a couple of my panelists have made it safe for self-promotion, I would be remiss if I did not mention I have written a book. Copies of the cover are out in the front desk. Copies are being printed up, I think, as I'm speaking, which should be available mid-December. And the publisher, in the spirit of the holiday season, currently is saying that if you order any print title in stock, you receive a 50% discount off the list price. If you'd like to buy one, visit www.greenwood.com, place your order, enter source code E0866A at the bottom of the first screen, and click user code, and you get your automatic discount. Sorry, had to say that. Okay. It is E0866A. Okay. Before we go any further, let me ask the audience a couple of questions, and raise your hand if it applies to you. How many of you have served in the U.S. military? Okay. And how many of you have children who are in or have served in the U.S. military? Mm-hmm. Okay. You should know that the proportion of you who responded to the first question is a little higher than most, and I've been asking this question for many years. And the non-response to the second question is entirely consistent with questions I've been asking for many years. And I think that gets us to the central underlying fact about the use of private security and military contractors that few people care to talk about publicly. And the reality is simply this. Private contractors, contrary to many commentators, and I'll be happy to talk about them later, did not crawl out from underneath a rock somewhere. Okay? They are on America's battlefields because the government, reflecting the will of the people, wants them there. As one editorialist noted, it's fashionable to look down on the civilian contractors employed by firms such as Halliburton and Blackwater. When contractors make the news, it's usually in the context of stories about waste and fraud in reconstruction or service contracts, or human rights abuses committed by private security contractors. So when civilian contractors die in Iraq, most of us don't waste many tears. These are guys who went to Iraq out of sheer greed, lured by salaries far higher than those received by military personnel, right? If they get themselves killed, who cares? But we should all care, not because it's our patriotic duty to support the lucrative corporate empires that employ the thousands of civilian contractors in Iraq, but because most of the men and women employed by these corporate giants are in Iraq at our government's behest, which means they are there at our behest. The reason, and I don't want to belabor this point because I think it's pretty simple, but the reason we have such reliance on private contractors is very simple. Cold War is over. Soviet Union is a historical memory. But the United States still reserves the right to operate militarily anywhere and everywhere. That's not a derogatory statement. That's just a statement of fact. We have, as we have had for decades, a unified command plan. We divide the world up into military quadrants. They each have their proconsul or commander-in-chief, or now Rumsfeld makes us call them combatant commanders. However, despite the so-called revolution in military affairs that Secretary Rumsfeld championed, it's still a highly people-powered endeavor. And most people have decided their children, much like Dick Cheney back during Vietnam, have, quote, better things to do, unquote. Now, my own view of the world is that the international order will continue to be roiled and disrupted for some time to come. Thus, there's going to be a void in international politics. And just as in nature, which abhors vacuum, private contractors will step in to fill it. And I don't think at that level there's anything wrong with that. I personally think that the outsourcing of military capabilities left the train station decades ago. It's taken this long for public perception to catch up, and people really only still see the rear of the train. If people don't want to use private contractors, the choices are extremely simple. Either scale back U.S. geopolitical commitments or enlarge military, something that will entail more gargantuan expenditures. And let's be honest about our current national security expenditure overall, not just for the Department of Defense, comes close to or possibly even exceeds $1 trillion a year. And also, if you want to enlarge military, you probably have to bring back the draft quite clearly. Personally, I prefer the former commitment, but most people prefer substituting contractors for draftees. As the former Marine Colonel Jack Holley said, quote, we're never going to war without the private security industry again in a non-draft environment. Still, I'd like to see a national debate on this. Instead, we bury our heads in the sand and let lots of people moan and groan about the presence of private contractors, and that's a waste of time. They are, after all, just doing the job we outsource to them. And like it or not, they're going to be around for a long time. And we should look at this a little bit historically, too. Private contractors doing military or quasi-military work are as American as apple pie. In fact, without private contractors, there would not have been in America. To paraphrase Genesis, in the beginning, God created private contractors. It was an Italian by the name of Christophorus, i.e. Christopher Columbus, who was essentially working as a private contractor for the King and Queen of Spain when he made his famous voyage in 1492, and subsequent ones that started the process of colonization, which foreshadowed the European settlement of the New World. And it was Captain John Smith, hired by the Virginia Company to provide security and conduct military operations for English settlers at Jamestown. During the American Revolution, more than 2,000 privately owned warships were commissioned by Congress to attack the enemy, seize transports, and sell their cargoes for money during the American Revolution. Sailors made more in a month than they might otherwise make in a year. Does that sound familiar to anyone? And on the ground, it was a private businessman who, before the start of the revolution, offered to build a 1,000-man army at his own expense if the Continental Congress, of which he was a member, failed to fund a standing military. That was a far more financially risky endeavor than anything a private security firm like Blackwater has ever attempted. Incidentally, that entrepreneur was George Washington. Okay, moving on. I do have opinions on pros and cons of governmental use of private military and security contractors, but I'm neither a diehard supporter nor a fervent opponent of their use. I don't have any dog in the fight over outsourcing things that used to be considered, quote, inherently governmental. As Mr. Spock used to tell Captain Kirk on Star Trek, I simply consider it to be a fascinating phenomena worthy of continuing study. I should say, just to give you an idea of how ubiquitous the presence of contractors is, we need to think beyond America. We do need to think globally. I should say I just came back from Europe on Wednesday evening. I was in Norway on the plane back after the interminable wait at Heathrow. I found myself sitting near a couple of contractors who were just coming back from Islamabad. I think another had just come back from Qatar. And incidentally, you might not have seen the report just yesterday by the Danish Institute for Military Studies, which says Denmark is unable to continue to have so many soldiers on demanding missions abroad without private companies taking over several of the soldiers' tasks. Of course, so goes Denmark, so goes the world. By the way, I should mention to you, having been in Europe, I'm happy to report that America is popular again. In fact, for those of you who are in these troubled economic times need to make money, I have two words for you: Obama T-shirts. Every time somebody found out I was American, they asked me if I could get them one. And speaking of President Obama, that was just a nice segue, I think private military and security contractors do not have much to worry about. Recall that at the beginning of the year, perennial PSC critic and gadfly Jeremy Scahill, author of a not very good book entitled Blackwater, blasted Obama for being too sympathetic towards contractors. He reported that a senior foreign policy advisor of Obama said that if elected, Obama would not, quote, rule out, unquote, using private security companies like Blackwater in Iraq. The advisor also said Obama does not plan to sign on to legislation that seeks to ban the use of those forces in U.S. war zones by January 2009 when a new president is sworn in. By the way, Obama not opposing the use of contractors in Iraq is equivalent to someone saying they don't oppose the setting of the sun in the West. You couldn't do it even if you wanted to, if for no other reason than contractors figure to be a prominent part of the eventual withdrawal. According to a past GAO report, as of April 26, there were approximately 149,400 DoD contractors, and as of July 1st, approximately 147,400 U.S. troops deployed in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, thus more contractors than regular active forces. And that's not counting the security contractors working directly for state in Iraq, according to an August CBO report. Obviously, if there were U.S. forces, military or otherwise, to spare for these roles, they'd be there. Much of their work protecting U.S. allied officials, other civilians involved in aid and reconstruction, will continue after a military pullout. Removing them now would likely delay the withdrawal of U.S. forces because U.S. personnel would have to replace them. That obviously would be counter to the pledge of President Obama. 2 minutes. All right, I'm going to have to speed up. A few high points, Sven. If you ever listen to any major contractor or industry group, like say, I don't know, the International Peace Operations Association, you'll understand that by and large, they really don't have much problem with accountability measures. Yes, they moan and groan periodically about added business costs and paperwork burdens, but they've all indicated that they can live with it. To paraphrase the old British expression, when you take the king's contract, you take the king's accountability along with it. And as an issue, accountability just keeps marching on. Consider some of the provisions in the current Defense Authorization Act. Section 1057 states the interrogation of enemy prisoners of war, civilian internees, other detainees, terrorists, and criminals when captured, transferred, confined, or detained during or in the aftermath of hostilities, an inherently governmental function cannot appropriately be transferred to private sector contractors. Section 854 requires mechanisms for ensuring that contractors are required to report offenses that are alleged to have been committed by or against contractor personnel. And insofar as this report the New America Foundation report calls for strengthening the contractor and acquisition workforce so it is better equipped to make contracting decisions and to conduct robust oversight and management of contractors, I say, God, yes. It's long overdue. The Gansler Commission report has been mentioned. The monitoring and implementation and auditing of contracts has long been a sort of in-house scandal. That's not the fault of contractors. That's the fault of the government. Government, even though it didn't anticipate the scale of Iraq and its need for contractors, long before they made the decision, they knew their dependence on contractors, knew they needed to keep better tabs, and did not devote the resources to it. So on that particular issue, we should be blaming the government for not living up to an obligation that was foreseeable, and they chose not to do it. I want to say that globally, accountability is looking up. The Montreux document, which was released in September, basically promulgates a global set of good housekeeping practices for contractors all around the world. The signatories include the United States, Great Britain, which are the largest users of contractors presently in the countries where the vast majority of them are headquartered. It's true, industry doesn't welcome all the things in the Montreux document, but because the United States has given its approval, they've got no choice but to essentially go along. I think I'll just end it with this one observation. I don't have a criticism of the report, but I do have one criticism generally about the debate, and it's simply this. Our perspective when we think about contractors is far too narrow. It's very easy to get myopic and talk about DynCorp, Control Risk Group, Rubicon, Aranis, Blackwater, Triple Canopy, etc., and focus on the people carrying guns or people doing logistics work for the log cap contract. The folks that Doug Brooks there always refers to as being the people who keep the military being the best supplied, best fed, best equipped, etc. Talk to him for tales about surf and turf out in Baghdad. But we need to think beyond that, because we have contractors supporting departments and agencies all throughout what we would term the national security establishment. That's intelligence. Read Tim Shorrock's book, Spies for Hire. 70% of intelligence budget is going to contractors. We have contractors doing border security. We have contractors doing public diplomacy. We have contractors doing information operations. Military is just one component of national security establishment, and contractors are in every other component beyond that. If you want to have a true debate on the topic, you need to think about the role, pros and cons, strengths, weaknesses, benefits, costs of the contractors and all those components. Then we can truly have the sort of considered, deliberative, empirical debate that this industry and this phenomena has been crying out for years. And I just want to say, generally, having had the opportunity to talk and converse with lots of contractors over the years, and all sorts of smack gets said about them. And it's at times like those that I really regret that I'm not a lawyer, because if I was, I'd probably be filing all sorts of successful defamation suits against various commentators and earning myself lots of money. I simply want to say that contractors, by and large, are not sinners. Not every single one, of course, is a saint, but they're certainly not sinners, people out there doing the job that we created for them. So if we've got a problem for them, let's think about why they're there and what caused that.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Thank you to the panel. What I want to do is start the Q&A, and I'm going to take the privilege to ask the first question. Where I think it seems like there's a general agreement that accountability really needs to be looked at hard, but I wanted to focus more on kind of this first principles, and David kind of wrapped up on that point. It's about this, to what extent has the government broadly, in whether it's the security context or other functions of the military, of governing, really kind of hived off its inherently governmental functions. There's a lot of comment, everybody I think said that we don't have a good definition. We're wondering what type of either legislative or executive action might be taken in the new administration. Are we coming to a place where there's going to be are we going to actually have a debate about this question in general? And what struck me is that there's actually another kind of case in which this is happening, and there's a solution that's coming out of it, and it happens right here in D.C. The D.C. Chancellor of the school system, Michelle Reed, has been dealing with a contracting problem. It's called charter schools. She's been dealing with how do you balance this? How do you get better performance out of her governmental function? And the solution that she's coming into hasn't really been discussed. It's paying their teachers the salaries that will get you good people. And that seems to be what contracting allows you to do, is to get the bodies into the roles to do the job the government has been asked to do. So I just want to open it up. I want to turn over to Michael. Are we going to be focused on this primary mission question that Tara outlined? Should we just focus on killing the enemy in the military context, and then should we be hiving off all other functions? Central Command, I know when they talk about their mission, they talk about presence, they talk about deterrence, they talk about diplomacy. There are all these other missions. Are we just going to continue hiving off all those other functions? Is it just going to be the warfighting function? How is this going to, and then I guess to the broad panel, how is this going to play out in the first year or two of the Obama administration? What do we see coming down the pike? So Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I'm listening to Tara and Kevin, my initial response, and David, my initial response was, everybody's a critic. But no, I want to thank them for their really thoughtful comments there. But I think one of the reasons why we, to answer your question, I guess in a way, it's sort of slightly above my pay grade to figure out what are the functions best that the military and busted by contractors. But that's the kind of debate that the military needs to be having, and this is both in the uniform military and civilian leadership of deciding what's the best mix of a civilian and uniform workforce. And I think that's the kind of discussion that's not happening. And I think one of the points Dave made I want to pick up on, this is not a problem that's just endemic to the Pentagon. This is a problem that exists across the entire federal bureaucracy. We rely on contractors to an extraordinary extent. On the national security field, as David said, it's quite vast. Intelligence is 70% of the budget goes to contractors. This is true with the State Department as well. Our reliance on NGOs, our reliance on private contractors, it's extraordinary. And what has been lacking over the years is, as this process has continued, is this sort of debate of saying, well, we're not getting rid of these contractors. there are those who will say we should stop it completely. It's, as David suggested, it's completely unrealistic. It's never going to happen. The question is, how do you fold those actors? How do you integrate them into the force, and also think about how do you ensure this accountability for them? And I think, one of the points that we drafted this report, we've been working this for a very long time, and one of the reasons we came up with is because this kind of conversation, which seems to me the most basic conversation to have about contracting, just is not taking place. It didn't take place in the military, certainly before the war in Iraq. A lot of discussions didn't take place in the Pentagon before the war in Iraq, and we can certainly talk about that. But this was a pretty fundamental conversation that did not occur. And to some extent, I'm not sure that while there have been efforts to improve accountability, legal accountability, I think these kind of systemic and institutional changes that we're talking about here really aren't being discussed the level they need to be. So I think, someone said in our conference that, over the Ganser report, that the first point to sort of solving an addiction, consider using that as addiction, is to recognize you have a problem. And I think, hopefully, one of the things we try to do with the report, and I think one thing's happened in general, is to realize there's a problem, and to realize that there needs to be, the military needs to think about this in a more systemic way. But I also have to say that I think, you know, to David's point as well, I think this is a very important point. You know, we try to be agnostic on this issue. We try to sort of think about the sort of middle ground of not being pro-contractor or anti-contractor. It's very difficult to talk about contractors, because whenever you do, someone always sort of says to you, oh, you're more Blackwater or something like that. And you have to say, well, that's not true. And actually, you know, the Blackwater is a very small part of the force in Iraq. In fact, there are 12,000 contractors in Iraq. I mean, I think Blackwater's number is obviously much smaller. And the vast majority of contractors in Iraq do not carry guns, do not carry weapons, and do not engage in any kind of violence. So I think in that sense, that kind of conversation, you know, hasn't been taking place. So I think that what our goal here was to try to get people to think about this in a much larger way than they have been thinking about it, and to get past some of the sort of rhetoric that we use to talk about contractors. So,
Tara and David.
It's like I'm standing on the beach and I'm trying to beat back the tide with a broom. It's common, right? We are so sure that there's a problem with contractors that we're calling it an addiction and talking about having to admit we have a problem. I would really like to see us back up to answer the question about inherently governmental function. What are we going to do about it, and how are we going to define it? Can we start with whether it's a problem to have the contractors performing these functions? Look at it this way. When it's time to build a tank, we don't stop and say, is a tank an inherently governmental product? Because if it is, and it is, we don't want contractors building it.
It used to be.
Exactly. When Max Weber, and the only lucid reason to talk about removing private security contractors like it's the end of the world, that we have guys with guns in a battlefield and they're not in military uniforms, the only lucid reason for that is this philosopher's notion, which I will tell you, I used to do a lot of writing in this area, I did a fellowship in this area, I was an academic who talked about it. I was out there saying, because it's such a profound little thing to say, the state should have a monopoly on the use of force. You can almost like hum something patriotic in the background of this. But when Max Weber wrote about that, we didn't let contractors build nuclear weapons either. I mean, we let them make products that we use for war. So the only realistic distinction is products versus services. And we don't sit around and twist our hands up and get our knickers in a whole twist about whether or not a tank is an inherently governmental product before we let a contractor build it. You know why? Because contractors are the best at building it. And there are some services that they're the best at too. And unless there's some other reason, some logical connection to not use the guys that are the best at this, then, you know, I really just want to see the debate back up. But like I said, I'm standing here with broom, and here comes the tide. We're going to have this coming in the next year or two. We're going to have a charge to decide the inherently governmental functions and redline this task and redline that task. I have a crazy, crazy thought. You ready? Let's pick the best guys for the task. Let's identify what tasks are best done by the military, like, say, killing people, and the tasks that are best done by contractors, which includes guarding certain resources wherever they may be.
So contractors are best in interrogation. I think they should do that.
Oh, that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah, and here's why. Because we don't know 3 years down the road what kind of language skills the Army needs. Do you know how long it takes to train an Army linguist? We could start now funding a whole new linguist corps that we want to have be proficient in. Yeah. And you know what? 2 years from now, 6 months from now, or 10 days from now, there could be a conflict in Turkey. And oh my God, we need linguists in Turkey. You know who's got those? Contractors. They have the flexibility to respond like that, and we ought to leave our government the power to respond like that by implementing those resources and bringing them to bear against the task.
It's the Nike model of government. Let's flip over to David.
Yeah.
I may have to rethink my whole perspective of my past military service, because as a former enlisted man, I'm not accustomed to agreeing with officers. But I do want to associate myself with her in this regard. I don't like much of a commentary about the debate on contractors, because I think it lends itself to, frankly, demagogic commentary in an internet age. any twit can get up there and say something snarky, and it's instantly broadcast around the world, and you don't find thoughtful, considered deliberations. The core competency of the military is to kill people and also to destroy things. Twofold mission. Everything else has been up for grabs, and we should be painfully honest about this. There are lots of skill sets out there which have never been in the military and aren't going to be in the military, and I want to point out a current example of that. The British contractor, BAE, holds a contract for HTS, the Human Terrain System. This is a program which basically calls for academic anthropologists along with support staff to go out, be embedded in a military unit in Iraq and Afghanistan, the two theaters are currently being used, go out, talk with the locals, be friendly, gain intelligence so the military doesn't go out and end up killing and wounding civilians, maybe get some useful information on the enemy so they can target the right people, be respectful of local ways. Now, that's a good thing. But the military doesn't train anthropologists. Universities train anthropologists, and they have to, and so they've gone out to universities. And this is sort of part of the overall Project Minerva. You looked it up. It's a good thing, and they're going to have to hire these people as contractors, which they do. I don't see why anybody should be against that. So the point is simply that we need to understand that not all contractors are entirely venal, money scrubbing people doing it just to make a quick buck. They're doing it because they have, honest to God, useful skills, which we need. That being said, however, not every contractor necessarily who provides, theoretically at least, people to do something are entirely honest or trustworthy. I mean, I would recommend a book by Rob Crott, which came out earlier this year. He talks about when he's a contractor on a mission to Somalia, and he was in charge of a bunch of interpreters that a firm here in the Washington area had gotten a contract for. And the firm grabbed up, any speakers of Somali that they could, cab drivers, dishwashers, regardless of whether or not they had the right dialect, and he said, a lot of these times, these people cannot communicate for us. Now, that's Rob Crott, that's not me, and he's a contractor himself, so, judge him on that basis. Now, I don't think that's typical, but again, it's not entirely unknown either. So all it means is that you need to build the mechanisms to ensure you have the proper accountability to monitor the contract on an ongoing basis.
Great, thank you, David. Kevin, do you want to do one last?
Yeah, just very briefly. Actually, to disagree with a couple of my co-panelists.
Grab the microphone too, that would help.
Other than Michael, the military that I grew up in, the primary mission actually wasn't to, or isn't to kill people and break things. It's to fight and win the nation's wars. There are a variety of ways to do that. There are kinetic operations and non-kinetic operations. The non-kinetic operations, which involve not doing violence to people, can be as important as the kinetic operations in fighting and winning a war. And I think that we see with the shift in strategy in Iraq and a focus on counterinsurgency, while obviously there still is an effort and a need to discriminately identify people who need to be captured or killed. The primary focus is to protect and secure the Iraqi population, which is not primarily about killing people and breaking things. And I make this point simply to make sure that we don't overly narrow the focus as we think about what is at the core of military functions and operations that we think uniformed military personnel, or at least public servants, need to perform rather than contractors. Now, that being said, to be clear, while we think it's critical for there to be serious discussion and debate over identification of functions that contractors shouldn't be doing, we do not envision that that's going to be a long list, or that anytime soon this country will or should rely empirically substantially less on contractors in activities not only like Iraq and Afghanistan, and hopefully we won't see anything like the commitment of U.S. resources to another conflict like Iraq anytime soon, but many other countries in the world that are in conflict or emerging from conflict that we will be continuing to send contractors to in order to advance American national security interests as well as to support the development of those countries. The problem, I think, that that we are in and that needs to be addressed. I think there is a small set of voices that think the problem is that we're using contractors, but I think the consensus is that the problem is that we haven't planned for using contractors the way that we're doing on the scale that we're doing, and we haven't resourced the government agencies that need to manage and oversee those contracts and those contractors in order to do that adequately. And that's the challenge that we face here, and that's the real problem that we face, and it is a real problem. I mean, to an extent, we can't put the toothpaste back into the tube, and we have to continue moving forward with the missions that we have. But we can now, and a new administration, we think provides us an opportunity, and a new Congress as well, make sure that we put those things that can be put in place quickly, get them in place before we continue to move forward and rely, I think, likely more heavily on contractors in Iraq as we begin to draw down forces, and then begin doing the heavy lifting on the more complex issues of changing cultures and addressing the more complex contracting management issues that the New America Foundation and Human Rights First and others have identified.
All those great reports out there. Okay, right here.
Just had a question for...
If you could state your name too.
I'm Andrea Shalal-Isa with Reuters, and I'm wondering about, there's a lot of attention being given now to what the priorities of the Obama administration should be. I mean, every group in every sector has a long list of things that they think are the most urgent to be addressed. And I wonder how realistic you think it is that this issue will be picked up by the Obama administration, and whether you've privately, individually had any conversations with people in the transition or in the campaign to indicate that that is the case. Then I also want to ask you if you think that the lack of planning for the use of contractors was in fact a deliberate move by the Bush administration. I mean, if you haven't planned, then it's a little bit easier to sort of let it go as far as it has. So I wonder if you think there's some degree of intentionality there in terms of where we are now, the situation.
For our web viewers, I just want to repeat the questions. First, what do we think the Obama administration will do? And then the second question is, was the reliance on contractors somehow intentional on the part of the Bush administration? Michael, do you want to?
I'm just going to take on the second part of the question. I mean, one of the elements of obviously using contractors, not just the military, but in any government bureaucracy, is that it creates a sort of lack of political accountability. To some extent, you can sort of follow off hostilities on private industry, and I think there's a philosophical sort of bent in this Bush administration toward privatization in general and toward use of contractors. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, considering the lack of intentional planning for anything post-war cases in Iraq, I hard to believe that they were able to think that circuitously about not using contractors. But I think it is a genuine concern that you can see policymakers rely on contractors as ways, again, to avoid political accountability. I think that probably wasn't
to
avoid political accountability, their own direct accountability. And I think that probably may have been certainly the back of the mind of certain policymakers, but I can't say I think it was an overly intentional act.
Is it really kind of that same question that led us to move from the draft force to the all-volunteer force? Is it the next layer of that? Is it about political accountability? As we're answering some of these questions, I'd just like the panel to think about that. But David.
On the first point, I'd simply say that given the number of competing priorities for President-elect Obama's attention, I doubt he's going to make this explicit promise on the use of private military or security contractors per se. However, he does have some record as a senator of being interested in overall federal procurement policy and the way government contracts its business out. He has sponsored or co-sponsored a number of bills on that. And I think at the level of overall federal procurement policy, and right now there seems to be a hot race for who will be the next director of that office, there will be some changes, and that will directly or indirectly impact the private military and security contracting industry. So I think, you know, there will be some administration focus, not in the first 90 days, but certainly within the next 4 years, even if it's not explicitly premised on that particular component of the industry. And as for the other part of it, I did look at that question in my book, and generally I tend to go to the simplest explanation possible, which is simply, no, it wasn't a deliberate decision on their part, they were simply incompetent.
Tara, did you want to respond to either
I
of
can
those?
take the first half of the question, I think. You asked if anybody on the panel was hopeful that these issues were going to get prominence. I can give you an anecdotal example of why I'm not hopeful at all. And it's because I tried to seek out people on the transition teams to talk to me about, hey, we're going to do something about the SOFA. I don't know if many people are following this particular discrete issue, but we have a status of forces agreement in Iraq that's going to expire on December 31st. We got a new draft that takes away the immunity, not just for contractors, but for the soldiers too. And it's a stunning departure from what we normally do in the United States when we send soldiers and contractors to, you know, work in support of the United States government's missions abroad. And that's going to expire. And I got to tell you, there was a long list of issues that were on the defense transition team. That one wasn't there. So I urge those of you who write and speak and have a public forum for a living to push that one a little bit, because I do think that we've had an interesting thing happen since Vietnam, and a lot of people have written about it, where we don't criticize our soldiers these days, and we shouldn't. We learned that lesson very, very well. But I really do think that we've turned a little bit of a corner where the last remaining acceptable invective is the contractor. And we have very mixed feelings about the war. So we want to vent them somehow, and boy, that's not the right way. And that's going to lead to things like a SOFA, where there's, I think, some perception that says, oh, contractors do it for the money, they'll go anyway. Well, holy cow, not if I'm their lawyer. If a company calls me and says, there's absolutely no immunity in Iraq, you can be performing your mission as your contract directs you, or as your responsibilities as an armed forces member of the United States military directs you, and if you do something that the Iraqi government determines violates their laws, you're subject to their criminal accountability system. I'm not real familiar with the criminal accountability system in Iraq, but I wouldn't subject myself to it right now, and I wouldn't advise a company to let their employees be subject to it either. So, you know, I think we have real dramatic impact coming from sort of a lack of attention to the issues that are relevant to contractors, and that overcorrection to, you know, one or two incidents that we think we know what happened. Nice First Square is a great example. We think we know what happened. You know why we think we know what happened? The only public information about that incident is from the plaintiff's lawyer's complaint. It was filed like a week or so after that incident happened. I did, as a plaintiff's lawyer, a complaint about a war crime. It's like 18 months of investigating and vetting and determining that you have the right people named and you know exactly who the victims were. You've collected all the evidence that can be there. You can't get that right in 4 days. So we don't have public information about what happens in these incidents. We don't know what actually happened in these incidents. We think we know, we talk about it, and we react to it. And this absence of immunity is one of those overcorrections and overreactions. And to answer your question more briefly, no, I don't think it's high on the list right now, but I think it should be.
Kevin?
Just try to quickly move through these issues. With the, I think I'm in agreement with everyone else that I don't think it was intentional that we've ended up where we have ended up with contractors. I don't think there was probably a diabolical plan to do that. To paraphrase one of our introductory remarks, you know, I think I recall discussing with other military colleagues that I was deployed with in Afghanistan. You go to war with the Secretary of Defense that you have. We are hopeful. I mean, we have been in contact with some members of the Obama campaign and now transition staff. We are hopeful that this will be a priority, or at least aspects of the agenda to address contractor issues and accountability will be a priority for the new administration. We've made recommendations, certainly in our blueprint, for some things the administration and President-elect Obama should immediately look at, including, we would hope, in order to put some heat and focus on the issue, looking at a partial moratorium on deploying more contractors to Iraq and Afghanistan until essential accountability mechanisms are in place, which essentially is major reform. The Department of Defense contractors that don't need to be covered by this, we don't call on there to be any sort of moratorium there because they're already double covered essentially by both UCMJ now and MEJA as well. But we think MEJA reform is teed up for quick action. The House passed it overwhelmingly in late 2007. Then Senator Obama was the principal sponsor in the Senate of companion legislation. And we think that if, obviously, President-elect Obama is interested in this issue, and we hope that it will be an early focus of the new administration. And if it's passed in terms of our recommendation on the moratorium, that would be the condition, and it need not even be a road bump in moving forward. We expect, and the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction predicted on the last day of October in a new report that as troops are drawn down, and it appears that this administration is determined to do that, there will be only increased reliance on contractors, including security contractors in Iraq. And it's just essential, and we hope the administration will take seriously the need to fix some pretty basic accountability issues before moving forward with a course of action that will actually increase reliance on contractors. And then finally on the SOFA issue, and we also have a recommendation in our blueprint for the President-elect to direct the new Attorney General immediately to lead an administration effort to look at whatever the arrangements are in place, whether it is still CPA Order 17 that confers immunity and nothing, or CPA Order 17 and an extended UN Security Council mandate, or a SOFA if it's in place. To scrutinize that and look at that from the standpoint of the impact it has on our ability to hold contractors that we feel abroad accountable. This hasn't been the fault in not having accountability mechanisms in place is not the industry. The fault is the U.S. government's, and the U.S. government has to take action to do that. I mean, there's not now a SOFA in place with Iraq. There never has been. I mean, where our troops are there, contractors are there under a Security Council mandate, and CPA Order 17, which was imposed by Ambassador Bremer in the last couple of days of the Coalition Provisional Authority regime, and then has continued generally, although there are some Iraqi officials who say that it's not Iraqi law. I think it's generally recognized now to be Iraqi law until it's changed. I mean, from all media reports, it looks like the Iraqi government is insisting that the immunity be changed, and that will be a consequence. I think that we have created, the United States government has created an atmosphere here where it's almost an issue of Iraqi self-determination. At least government officials and a lot of people in that country see it as an issue of self-determination because we have not apparently been able to hold accountable contractors who are accused of serious crime. And again, it's not the private companies whose responsibility is that. They have no ability to prosecute their own people. That's a government function. I think it's an inherently government function, and we've got to tackle that and get it done.
Okay.
I doubt. I doubt it will have. If immunity is lifted, I doubt it will have the drastic effect on recruitment and fielding contractors. These contractors already are taking and accepting significant risk to their life and health by deploying. I don't doubt that it will affect the decision of some to go back or not, but these people have accepted a lot of risk.
Michael, what I'm going to do is ask you just to tag your answer to after the next question comes out. We just want to get the questions up.
Sure.
In the back, sir. Yeah. Sir, please.
I'm Eric Prince from Blackwater, and I just want to thank the New American Foundation for having try to be a fact-based, non-hyperbolic debate on these issues and get the facts out. I would invite each of the panelists to come down and see our operation sometime. I would disagree with you on the your last comment on if the community is completely gone on its effect of people that are willing to do it over there. But and I would also remind everyone that private security contracting was not something that was done by this administration. It was done in the mid-90s, so it's not new.
Did you have a question, sir?
No.
Okay. That was easy. Radiation.
Yeah, my name's Levi Lee. I'm also in the defense contracting industry. And I noticed that with the topic of the changing culture of Pentagon contracting, we've talked a lot about how important the logistical stuff is, and that's a great aspect of contracting. And also how the private security, although it's only about 6 to 7% of actual contractors in country, has taken up most of the debate. My question is more in relation to the intelligence community. And facing the just continued sophistication and asymmetrical threat that we face, what is the future that you see of the Pentagon's contracting in relationship to intelligence analysis?
Okay, Dave, you want to take it, Greg? Tara?
Did you see Senator Webb, October 21st? He's got I don't even know what he put forward, a call to the new administration to, here's my best example. It's his particular most recent call to the new administration. Let's hold all funding for what he describes as information gathering services to be performed by contractors. And what it boils down to when you drill down on it is the InfoSec guys, the guys making comic books to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqis. Let's drop a hammer down and make sure we're not having contractors do that because it's inherently governmental. I think that's where we're going, and I think it's going to, intelligence gathering functions, because Abu Ghraib got so much attention. I don't know if you've probably seen the sense of the Senate, that's at Section 832 of the Defense Appropriations Act. I see a snowballing effect of overcorrection, and I think you're right. We're looking at 6 or 7% of people who are gun-carrying private security contractors, and we're rolling from there into concern about all of these additional missions that may very well, like say, making comic books be something that contractors might be very well positioned to do effectively. And I think we're going to see a movement, at least, to roll back all of that.
I want to have one quick point on just, and this is about, you mentioned Senator Webb, and this is just one point to an earlier question about new confidence, also Senator Obama. One thing that really is underreported a little bit is the extent to which Congress deserves a lot of credit for what they've done the last 2 years to focus more attention on this issue. One of the big reasons why this issue was not addressed is because, to be blunt about this, in the first 6 years of the Bush administration, the Republican-dominated Congress did not do anything significant on contractor oversight. And it was a lot, I think, of the problems we've had today are because of that. And what's happened in the last 2 years, not only the change at Pentagon leadership from Secretary Rumsfeld to Secretary Gates, which I think has been a real positive since the contractor issues, but Senator Webb and Senator McCaskill in particular have been great on this issue. They have created the contracting commission, the Wartime Contracting Commission, which is, I think, a really significant development and one that will hopefully produce a lot more information, as Mr. Prince said, a lot more fact-based information on the issue of contracting. So I think, that's why I have a little more confidence than Tara on this issue, because I feel that in Congress and in the Pentagon, that there is a lot more attention to this question, and there's a lot more attention to the fact that this is a significant problem.
David, then Kevin.
Just quickly, I think there will be continued great reliance on contractors within the intelligence community. I don't see a mandate to cut back. I do see, however, concern simply that the intelligence community itself has expressed that it does not know the extent to which itself relies on contractors. When people like Michael Hayden say before Congress in testimony that I can't actually answer your question, Congressman, about how many contractors we employ or what percentage of the budget it is, but I have instituted a group to get me that information. You see that they themselves are a little bit perplexed, and if you think perennially that the Department of Defense has been for decades rated by the GAO, one of the most high-risk government agencies, simply in terms of trying to audit its own monies, which it never knows how it's spent or even if it's been spent. you can kind of say the same in spades for the IC. It's not to say that they're going to suddenly get rid of green badgers and cut back, but I think there will be a little bit more concern about trying to find out the extent before they continue to have even greater lines. In other words, find out where we are, then we can assess how we move forward.
Great. Kevin, real quick.
I think the task ahead is much as with the military. I mean, pulling apart the different contractor activities into the intelligence community and money's being spent on them and identifying functions that shouldn't be performed by contractors or perhaps by anyone. In the intelligence agency, we've talked about interrogators, which is distinct from the linguists or the interpreters, who I think we can never get away from relying on contractors for the linguist services. But other activities that reports have contractors involved in the intelligence community in different aspects of renditions that they've been involved in, the logistics and aviation services involved in that. And I think they're hopefully, as Michael said, the new administration and the Congress can build on the work of Congress of the last couple of years at bringing greater transparency to the use and activities of contractors. And certainly, we think there has to be much more transparency even than there has been to date. If we are going to be outsourcing increasing aspects of government operations that traditionally have been performed by government personnel, the consequence of that shouldn't be to immunize people from political accountability then for those activities. If that should bring with it more transparency, even to private industry, the contracting companies that are doing this, that's got to be part of the price of getting these government contracts, that there is going to be greater transparency. There was a proposal in Congress last year to extend FOIA to the private prison industry in the United States that contracts with the Bureau of Prisons. We've recommended in the blueprint that it be extended to private security contractors who are contracted abroad. I mean, we need to, if we are going to outsource and contract traditional government functions, there needs to be a lot more transparency.
Okay, some more questions? Start at the back.
I'm troubled by the fact that this whole thing seems to be driven more by ideology and the fact that we're trying to maintain an all-volunteer force and carrying on 2 wars, and the mission was accomplished in 2003. I think that these things kind of all contributed because the practicality of having an additional force, of private contractors who would get paid at least 12 or more times than the people who are working there is a problem. I mean, you have enough of a problem between the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines working together through a private contractor. The reason I raise this issue is we have lost the ability in our armed forces to do civil affairs. And civil affairs was a very important mission in World War II, which we did very well. But and it seems like based on the criteria supplied earlier that, if we go kill people, bomb stuff, and then turn it over to someone else, civil affairs is automatically contracted out using that. And civil affairs is a key component of, so...
If you could turn it into a question and then also state
the question is,
your affiliation.
The question is basically, to what extent did these things impact this, the fact that we're trying to maintain an all-volunteer force, what did that have, what kind of influence did that have on the contractors? And 2, what do you do with civil affairs? Because you really have to go in and hold an area, and I think you're much better doing it with military personnel than contractors early on, in the first stages. And I really want to see civil affairs improved in the military. I'm afraid it might not be, given this new emphasis.
Okay, and who are you, sir?
I'm sorry, Jim Chase.
Okay, thank you. David, you want to take a break?
Well, I actually addressed this in the book, so I'll just quote from it. As someone who joined the military at the inception of the all-volunteer force, I appreciate your question. I'll simply quote someone here. When U.S. military shifted to an all-volunteer professional force in the wake of the Vietnam War, military leaders set up a series of organization tripwires to preserve the tie between the nation's foreign policy decisions and American communities. Led by then Army Chief of Staff General Creighton Abrams, they wanted to ensure that the military would not go to war without the sufficient backing and involvement of the nation. But much like a corporate call center moved to India, this, quote, Abrams doctrine, unquote, has since been outsourced. Now, that's unassailably true. I mean, people don't want to give resources for the all-volunteer force to do everything they wanted to do, be all it can be, and contractors are that filler material, inserted into that gap. And civil affairs is, just one of the capabilities they lost along the way, just like they had downsized overall special operations forces until at least the aftermath of Goldwater Nichols, when they set up the Special Operations Command and started to give a little bit more emphasis. Now, the only other positive trend is that there are things in progress now which are civil affairs oriented, which they are giving both more resources to from the military, but they also involve contractors. And Chris Taylor, a former vice president of Blackwater, has been involved with the Marrow Project, which is something that's been worked on by former DOD official Sarah Sewell, now up at Harvard, who may very well be back in government under an Obama administration, and that will give increased civil affairs-like capabilities. But I think it's interesting to note, simply because we're not even with increased public emphasis, it's still going to involve contractors, because, as Doug Brooks often points out, they are often at times the only people who have the capabilities necessary to do it, and that's just a fact of life.
Thank you, David. Civil affairs or the Abrams doctrine, Kevin?
I just said one thing about.
Oh.
Go
Ken?
ahead.
Yeah,
I'll
no.
go afterwards.
Thanks.
As the only civil affairs officer probably in this room. Oh, two of us, okay. Some of the broader issues that you raise, I think, Cameron, should be addressed in the QDR, and New American Foundation has made a recommendation that in the next quadrennial defense review, broader issues about balance between contractors and uniformed force be addressed. We also, in our blueprint, make a similar recommendation to use the upcoming QDR, which will play out during the course of 2009, building toward a 2010 report, look at some of these longer range issues. I guess I'm not optimistic that they would look at draft versus all volunteer military, but I think that you are probably right that a decision to go to an all voluntary military, and then in conjunction with that, to not pay for seriously pay for certain professional expertise in civil affairs has degraded what civil affairs can do. The human terrain teams that David mentioned and the BAE contract, in theory, civil affairs should be able to do that, but civil affairs doesn't have the expertise to do it. In World War II, there were anthropologists in the Army. They were drafted and they were assigned to civil affairs unit. But we don't get that now. And unlike while the military services paid seriously for pilots and for doctors, they're not paying seriously for economists and anthropologists and others that would be a way to have civil affairs have that kind of capability in an all-volunteer force. But I suspect it's just not going to happen. I'm not sure that on the horizon, within sight, there's going to be any fundamental change to that.
I just want to add one thing, and this goes back to the point someone asked earlier about was it intentional to have the contractors? I don't think it was, but there's something else to think about. If in 2003 George Bush had said to the American people, I'm going to send 350,000 troops to Iraq to fight the war, I think there would have been a lot more public disapproval of that idea. But yet there are 350,000 individuals in Iraq that are devoted to the U.S. mission there. So, yeah, there is a price to be paid for that. The fact that you have an all-volunteer force, which is the political costs, are for contractors who are ignored. And we don't talk about contractors who have been killed there. And we know of at least 1,200 that we know for sure. Thank you, Doug. Contractors mostly locals. It's a good point. They are still working on behalf of the U.S. mission. But we talk about thousands of contractors who have been killed, who have been wounded, and their stories don't ever get told. And they are, in fact, as David said earlier, working on our behalf in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Great. Right here in front.
Greg Sanders, CSIS. We actually have done a report on service contracting nationwide, and there's been a few calls for greater empiricism In FPDS, we've been, main contracting database, we've been able to find about 20 billion based on performance of rack, which seems pretty low based on the 1 in 5 figure. Do you guys think there's any good sources out there that just need someone to grind through, or is just data isn't produced?
Pardon me while I look directly at Doug Brooks as I make these remarks, because we've been having a long-standing dialogue, yes, that's what we'll call it, about this issue of cost effectiveness on contractors, and Doug's viewpoint, I think fairly rendered, is that they are inherently cost effective. Turn on a dime, more flexible, more nimble, less bureaucratic apparatus as opposed to your counterparts in the public sector. And my response to that is, maybe. We don't know. Why don't we know? Because there's never been explicit apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparisons in the public sector, or at least disclosed in a public realm. And Eric, I think in his testimony the other year before Congress, back in late 2007, very rightly said, we don't know, let's have a study group and work that out. And I think that's exactly right. That's what we need to do. But we haven't done it. Now why that is an interesting question. Maybe I'll get to write a column about it someday. I don't know. But until they do, even if you call the experts, and I have in mind people like Paul Murphy at Eagle Eye, who works the federal procurement data system database, better than anyone, will tell you we can't disaggregate it to the level where we can do that kind of a comparison. So if he can't do it, nobody else out there has done it, short of it being highly classified, and it'll never see the light of day, at least, to you and I. So, I'd endorse in Derek's call, let's get economists going, and do those sort of comparisons, and then we can have the debate.
I think the cat's probably out of the bag for historical data now. And there's just, for years there has been a failure to require reporting of data and thus a failure to collect data. I think that there's probably no to limited ability to go back and try to capture data that was never collected because it never had to be reported. Which certainly is one reason why we call for much more intensive reporting of data. But I would think that it would be very useful to really, and perhaps the Commission on Wartime Contracting would be one source where this might come out of, to do a very thoughtful, comprehensive take on what kind of data information we need to have reported in order for there to be, first of all, basic transparency, but in order to do a lot of things like really figure out the cost effectiveness of contractors in different spheres. The SIGR's report from October 31st again, reported $6 billion spent on private security contracting in Iraq since 2003 on 75 companies, but then also indicated that there's evidence of U.S. government contracts with 193 other companies, security companies, and no cost or expenditure data. And that's just not going to be reconstructed. But if we make a decision, that we're going to require a lot more data and reporting and transparency on a going forward basis, then we can begin doing kinds of analyses that we should have been doing all along.
And just to say, the CBO report that came out, I believe it was August, which basically said the cost of using security contractors, using private security contractors is not much different if you had the military do it. And the long-term benefit, of course, is that you don't have to pay the legacy costs. And that's really where a lot of the cost savings come and are often not talked about in contractors. I mean, yes, contractors may cost more in the short term, but in the long term, the health benefits, the pension benefits are extraordinary. And by the way, this is a great underreported story about the Iraq War, that when you think about the legacy costs, I believe that we're paying about $5 billion a year in healthcare costs for veterans of the first Gulf War. Think about what the price is going to be for this war and annual costs. So in that sense, there is a big savings, but it's something I think that doesn't get enough coverage. You're talking about contractors in general.
Okay.
Although it would be important, I think, in any comprehensive look at again the cost effectiveness of contractors in these areas, to look at other legacy costs, which is contractors who come back from Iraq, without veterans benefits without health insurance, and we end up paying for, whether it's through, Medicaid, or because they end up in a hospital emergency room, with no health insurance, there's that cost as well, and that needs to be factored into the analysis, as well as other issues.
Tara, you can grab a microphone too.
Oh, sorry. I just want us to stay mindful of the limited nature of our reach. We can legislate the heck out of it, and we can create criminal accountability, and we can have limitations on what we allow contractors to do. But we're going to reach the American citizens, right? We're going to reach the American companies. And let's remember that we're talking about problems that we've identified in Iraq. And how many of the contractors in Iraq are American citizens or American companies? I don't know the exact percentage, but it's not very high. I think it's 80 to 85% of the contractors in Iraq right now are not Americans. So our reach is pretty limited when we're proposing all these remedies. So what we might accomplish is legislating the really good, well-run American companies out of business and out of Iraq. And those functions and activities are still going to take place. So if our goal is to, I don't know, eliminate harm to Iraqi civilians, or eliminate, human rights abuses, or whatever you want to identify as our ultimate goal as a society, let's not implement responses that are counter to that goal, bearing in mind that all we can reach is the Americans involved.
Well, I need to shut it down because we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for the great panel. I think if there wasn't a debate before, I think we just launched it. I think we've laid out some of the the battle lines for it, and I thank you all for coming. And I just want to give Michael and the panel a warm round of applause.